So let's talk about how you describe a piece of property in the United States, which is crucially important to oil and gas because in the United States you own the oil and gas under that land. So there are several land description systems that are used in the U.S. The one that's used in Texas, as well as some of the original 13 colonies, etc., is called metes and bounds. And really, that's just the term for any kind of non-systematic description. So it means, you might say that on one side, your property is bounded by the highway. On the other side, it's bounded by a river. You can really use anything to describe that piece of property. Now, the most common system in most of the U.S. is the public land survey system, which is a rectangular system based off of certain east to west baselines and certain north-south meridians, and we'll talk a fair bit about that. The other way that's often done, and this is often done in metes and bounds systems like Texas, is by map reference. So you might say within a subdivision, there's a map that shows what property each person holds, and that determines their property. You can also describe land simply by coordinates. If you had a square property or a quadrilateral rectangular property, you could describe it with GPS coordinates or otherwise. Now, most lands in the United States use that federal rectangular surveying system that was mandated by Congress in 1785, and we'll see that it's used for most of the states that came in to the Union after that, with the exception of Texas and Florida as well. So some parts of the Southwest, along with Florida and Texas, still use that metes and bounds descriptions. Now, obviously, those land descriptions are very important for oil and gas development because really two reasons. One is we know that you get the oil and gas that comes from a well on your land because of the rule of capture, which we'll talk about more. So you better be very sure that well is in fact on your land. And as we'll see, there's rules, in fact, about how far from a border of your land you can drill. But probably most importantly, you need to know your acreage, because what we'll see is that often oil from a well is shared between multiple landowners, and that is typically determined on the basis of how much acreage each of those landowners has, as well as the state often only allows you to pump a certain amount of oil from a given well, and that's determined by the acreage that's assigned to that well. Now, here's that public land survey system, and you can see those different baselines drawn from east to west, and those meridians, those principal meridians, drawn north and south. Now, what I want you to see is that in some of the first states that were surveyed under this system, the surveying got a little bit complicated. You can see that look at Ohio or even Alabama and Mississippi. If we zoom in even more on Ohio, we see their very complicated system of those east-west baselines and those principal meridians. Now, by contrast, if we go out west here to Oklahoma, just north of us here in Texas, and you can see that they really, for most of the state, just have two lines, an 1870 baseline and this Indian meridian. And so, zooming in again further, we can define townships, which are just kind of squares. Typically, there are a square that's 6 miles on each side that are defined by reference to that east-west baseline and that meridian, that principal meridian. And so that X marks a spot that is called the Township 4 North, Range 3 East meridian, right? So that is showing you that it is 4 north of the baseline and 3 east of that Indian meridian, as you can see in your book at page 53. Now, let's zoom in again. I told you that township was 6 miles on a side. If you take that township and divide it into 1 mile square sections, so sections that are each a mile on a side, because it is 6 miles by 6 miles, you get 36 sections. So each of these sections, 1 square mile, that's 640 acres. Those sections, those 1 square mile sections within a township, those 640 acre sections, typically are numbered the way that I'm going to show you here. So start in the northeast corner. you get the number 1, you count across to the northwest corner, so you go 1 through 6 this way, then you turn around 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, turn around again 13, 14, 15, 16. That back and forth method, probably familiar with it from a fantasy football draft. That technical term for that is boustrophodonic, which means turning like a cow. The idea is, that's how you would plow a field if you had oxen pulling, yoked in, plowing that field. So, in your next fantasy football draft, if somebody forgets the order, you can just tell them, oh, it's got to be boustrophodonic order, or you can tell them it's the same way that you order sections in a township, whatever you think would be most helpful in that scenario. So now we're going to actually zoom in one further time onto a single one of those sections, which is just 640 acres. Now, you could own all of that. You could own all 640 acres, but oftentimes, of course, that 640 acres is broken down into even further properties. Now, these properties will be described in your book, and you want to be able to, from that verbal description, draw which part of the section they're talking about, because it'll help you just to understand, how do these properties border each other? Is one north of the other? Is one east of each other, etc.? So it's helpful to know both how, what we looked at in the last slide, how sections are numbered within the township, but also then how you describe a piece of land within that 1 square mile section, within that 640 acre section. Now, some of these pieces of land are pretty easy to describe. Look at that top right one, the northeast quarter, right? So 1 quarter of 640 acres, it's 160 acres. It's top right, northeast quarter. That makes perfect sense. Sometimes it'll be a little bit more challenging. Let's take a very challenging one. This is more challenging than anything you'll see throughout the book, but if you can understand it, you'll be able to locate any piece of property. Let's look at this tiny little property marked with an X down here. And so I want us to look at that and look at the description of that you would see in the book. Okay, so the correct legal description is the southeast 1 quarter of the southeast 1 quarter of the southwest 1 quarter of the southeast 1 quarter of the whole section. So here we're saying this is section O in township O. Doesn't matter what the name of the full section is. Now, when you see a description like that, let me encourage you, this is the way to start. Start from the end and work your way backwards. Because if we start with this description of the southeast 1 quarter of section O, that's easy enough to find. Where's the southeast 1 quarter? Well, it's this whole part. That's the southeast 1 quarter. Okay, let's take it another step. So this is the southeast 1 quarter. What's the next step? Okay, it's the southwest quarter of that southeast 1 quarter. Where's that? Well, that's this. That's all those 6 properties there in the southwest 1 quarter of the southeast 1 quarter. Take it a step further. The southeast 1 quarter of that southwest 1 quarter. So the southeast 1 quarter of that southwest 1 quarter of the southeast 1 quarter. Okay? Last step. The southeast 1 quarter of that southeast 1 quarter of the southwest 1 quarter of the southeast 1 quarter. That's how we find that piece of land. So when you see that description in your book, you want to just start from the end, start from the biggest plot of land, and work your way down to the precise property that is being described.